It began in Kano, Nigeria, in 1943. A young boy named Sani Abacha, born to Kanuri and Shua Arab parents, would rise to become one of the most controversial leaders in African history. But how did a quiet military officer rise from obscurity to rule Nigeria with an iron fist? Abacha's journey was the textbook definition of strategic ambition. After training at prestigious military institutions like the Mons Officer Cadet School in the UK and serving in the Nigerian Civil War, he steadily climbed the ranks. His key to success? Loyalty to power and the ability to wait for the perfect moment. By the 1980s, Abacha had become a familiar face in military coups. He was the only Nigerian officer to have participated in every successful coup in the country's history, from the 1966 counter-coup to the one that brought General Muhammadu Buhari to power in 1983. But his most decisive move came in 1993. After the annulment of Nigeria's freest and fairest election on June 12, 1993, won by MKO Abiola, the country descended into chaos. The interim government of Ernest Shonekan was weak and lacked legitimacy. Abacha, then defense minister, saw his chance. On November 17, 1993, he forced Shonekan to resign and assumed control as head of state. Just like that, Nigeria fell under military rule once again. This time, under a man whose name would be etched into the nation's memory forever. Under Sani Abacha, Nigeria entered one of its darkest periods of authoritarian rule. His regime was brutal. Thousands of activists, journalists, and political opponents were arrested or forced into exile. The media was muzzled, civil society was decimated, and the people lived in fear. But the most chilling act of Abacha's regime came in 1995. Ken Saro-Wiwa, the famed environmental activist and writer, led a non-violent campaign against the environmental degradation of Ogoniland by oil companies like Shell. For his activism, he was arrested alongside 8 others, known as the Ogoni Nine, and charged with murder in a sham trial. Despite international outrage, Abacha ignored the pleas. On November 10, 1995, Saro-Wiwa and the others were hanged. Nigeria was suspended from the Commonwealth. Sanctions followed. Yet Abacha remained unmoved. His message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. Under his watch, mysterious disappearances became common. Human rights organizations documented cases of torture, arbitrary arrests, and extrajudicial killings. Prominent voices like Fela Kuti were harassed. Newspapers that dared to criticize the regime were shut down. Fear was the currency of the realm. And yet, despite the brutality, many Nigerians remember that era with mixed emotions. Why? This is where the paradox of Sani Abacha begins to unfold. Despite being accused of massive corruption, stealing over $5 billion according to global estimates, Abacha's economic policies surprisingly brought some stability to Nigeria. His administration reduced Nigeria's external debt. Foreign reserves grew from $494 million in 1993 to $9.6 billion by the time of his death in 1998. The exchange rate was relatively stable. Inflation dropped. He funded infrastructural projects and paid off parts of the country's debt. Some argue that his fiscal discipline helped save Nigeria from complete economic collapse. So how do you balance a man accused of looting the nation with also stabilizing its economy? To many ordinary Nigerians, especially those living through the inflation and currency crashes of later years, Abacha's era felt more stable, even if it came at the cost of freedom. But make no mistake, the corruption under Abacha was legendary. Millions of dollars were funneled into foreign accounts. Some of these funds are still being repatriated decades later. In 2020, the US and Jersey authorities repatriated $311 million in Abacha loot back to Nigeria. So again, we are faced with a complicated question. How do you judge a man who stole billions, yet ensured the average citizen could still afford to eat? On June 8, 1998, Sani Abacha died suddenly in Abuja under mysterious circumstances. Official reports claimed it was a heart attack. Others whispered about poison. Some blamed Indian prostitutes. Others pointed to internal betrayal. The truth remains murky, and his death marked the end of an era. Nigerians poured into the streets to celebrate. There were parties, dancing, jubilation. For many, the tyrant was gone. But for others, the questions began. What would Nigeria look like without Abacha? His sudden death opened the door for Nigeria's return to democracy in 1999. General Abdulsalami Abubakar succeeded him and eventually handed over to a civilian government led by Olusegun Obasanjo. In the years that followed, the extent of Abacha's looting became clearer. Swiss banks returned hundreds of millions. Nigerian governments continued to track and recover stolen assets. Yet surprisingly, some groups began to praise Abacha's legacy. In 2018, then-President Muhammadu Buhari, who had served under Abacha, called him a good leader. He argued that Abacha built roads, hospitals, and paid off debts. To many, this sounded like rewriting history, but to others, it reflected a complicated truth, that in Nigeria, legacies are rarely black and white. Was Sani Abacha good or evil? This question continues to haunt Nigeria's collective memory. To human rights activists, the answer is clear. He was a dictator, a human rights abuser, and a thief. The execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the disappearances, the fear, these cannot be justified. To many economists, however, his monetary policies brought temporary relief. The naira was strong, salaries were paid, foreign reserves were healthy. To some Nigerians, especially those who value order over freedom, Abacha was the last man who brought discipline to the country. To others, he was the worst kind of tyrant, one who wore the mask of stability while bleeding the nation dry. His rule challenges us to ask deeper questions. Can economic stability justify the erosion of civil liberties? How do we measure the worth of a leader, by prosperity or by justice? Abacha's name remains synonymous with both order and oppression, with wealth and wickedness. He ruled for just 5 years, but even today, his legacy lingers. In stolen funds, in silent graves, in stabilized budgets, and in the stories people still argue over. So, what do you think? Was Sani Abacha a necessary evil, a misunderstood patriot, or simply a dictator whose sins outweigh his achievements? History is often written in shades of gray, but it is up to us to remember, to question, and to learn. If you found this documentary insightful, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into Africa's untold stories.